I'm going to start by telling you where we get our information that you see in your data reports. Then we'll kind of move through each section, and I'll just let you know some things to keep in mind when you're trying to understand the numbers and interpret what's in there. On page 2, we start with a section on demographics. The demographics that we get come from the US Census, and specifically the small area income and poverty estimates. Our data on entry into child welfare, and much of the child welfare data actually comes from fosteringcourtimprovement.org/NE, so you can access this data at any time. But this data actually originates from DHHS, and it is the AFCARS and NCANS data that they aggregate and publish for us based on a lot of different factors. So you can look at this data by county, you can look at it by state, by our teams for Through the Eyes of the Child, by DHHS service area, and also by judicial district. So you can access that in many different ways. What you have is mostly team data reported. We also this year used the Voices for Children report, but because the rest of our report is a little bit more current, we're hoping next year we can use more original sources. But they have been wonderful in working with us and helping us understand the data, but our timing is so different that they end up being about a year earlier than what we're talking about in here. DHHS did provide us with some original data that we looked at, including the data on removals that's in the report. And then we also use their YRTC annual reports. The Crime Commission provided us information on youth and diversion. And then lastly, the Administrative Office of the Courts and the Administrative Office of Probation provided us data. And somewhere in this room, way in the back, is Linda Leatherman, who many of you have worked with. I started July 31st, so without her help, there is no way I could have understood what I'm trying to present to you today. So she has spent probably just as many hours working on this as I have. Our data reports look fairly similar to what you've seen in the past if you've been on a Through the Eyes of the Child team before. We have a lot of the same sections. The demographic section is the same, entry into child welfare, your Justice 3A case progression, as well as your permanency sections. All of those have been in previous reports. Starting last year, we included the Juvenile Justice sections. And so last year was the first time we had information on entry into the juvenile justice system and on probation. This year is the first year we have been able to include juvenile justice case progression. And so we do have that data. It is a little bit more limited because it is our first year, and we'll talk about that when we get to this section. Some data tips. When you look at the census information, I just want to point out using the census data for the state of Nebraska is really tricky because of the 17 versus 18 versus 19 issues that we have running into. So the census only gives us data either for 17 and under, or they group 18 and 19-year-olds together. So I tried to be clear which definitions I was using, but just keep that in mind when you look at those things like child poverty rates. For the entry into child welfare, the AFCARS and NCANS data actually looks at 3 different populations. And we made sure, as we were putting the report together, that each 3 of the populations are separated out, so we don't switch back and forth between the 3. So we start with anything that's been reported as maltreatment or substantiated as maltreatment. That's going to be our first population that we look at. The second population we look at is all removed children, right? They're different than even substantiated maltreatment cases. And then the third population we look at is all children who are in foster care, right? Which is another entirely different population. So we tried to make it very clear which population we're looking at, but you may need to kind of read the subtext to see that, just so you know which ones. That's why the numbers are never the same, right, as we move through each one. When we get to the Justice 3A progression, many of you have seen these before, but I want to explain how we draw our cases. The data I received was updated as of June 30th, 2015, so the end of the state fiscal year. But I can't give you a full analysis of all cases that come into the court system through June 30th. Because if a case is filed on June 30th, then of course it hasn't hit all these case progression points that we're talking about. So we used the most up-to-date data, but we drew our sample by backing up a significant number of days depending on which hearing we're talking about. So for instance, when we're talking about the information on petition to first appearance, we backed up by 30 days to draw our sample. So our sample goes from June 1st to May 31st of the next year. And then we did that for each one. Some are backed up by 90 days. Some things like time to first permanency hearing, we had to back up a whole year to pull our sample. Okay, so that's why those date ranges look strange when you're looking at them, but it's all current as of June 30th, 2015. Okay? A couple of things to note which are not as big of a deal on this side of the state. If there are too few cases, 5 or fewer, we don't report that in a graph form just because it's too easy for one case to skew your data, too easy for a person who is looking at it saying, oh, I know about Johnny who went into the court system and now I can figure out what's happening with his case. So if we have more than 5, we report it. With missing data, if there is more than 50% missing data, we don't report that either because it would be too skewed. That says something is going on with the data entry, and so it looks like your hearings are maybe not properly represented, so we don't report that. I will say that the CIP team in the past has worked with the teams, and you can really tell that when you look at the Justice 3A case progression. That data is much cleaner than what it has looked like in previous years, so that's really good. When we look at 3A subtypes, as I was doing this analysis and working with Linda, we noticed that something's going on with our 3A subtypes. And what seems to be happening is that cases that are technically neglect cases or even physical abuse cases are being entered as homeless cases because that's the first option and it's not clear on the petition which one it's supposed to be. So that's something just to keep in mind. I don't think it's as much over in this side of the state, but we did have one county where 92% of their cases were homeless, and we just don't think that's actually how it's working. So just keep that in mind when you look at that, that's an issue we're addressing right now. I will also say that this year we did change one variable. Previously, we measured time to jurisdiction termination, which means the courts no longer have active jurisdiction of the case. We've changed this to time to case closure. And the reason we changed it is because several of our counties list multiple children on a single case. And so if we were measuring to jurisdiction termination, we might be just measuring termination on one kid, while other kids are still active. And so what we did is we went ahead and changed that variable, which means that this year's report will not necessarily be comparable to last year's report when looking at that particular variable. But I did provide you 2 years worth of data in this year's report for that one. When we get to our next section, permanency and child welfare, because permanency is a much less frequently occurring issue than, say, the case generation in the first place, what we have done for that section is provide you information by DHHS service area. Otherwise, too many teams would have a report that just says no data on it. We did divide up by teams when we talked about type of discharge and then in permanent home or free for adoption. When we talk about entry into the juvenile justice system, this is the data that we pulled from the Voices for Children report. Yet after I'd completed all the analysis and we were getting ready to publish, we figured out that I actually do have access to that through Justice. So this year's report, it's a year old compared to the rest of our data. That will not be the case next year. So we'll have that updated next year.
Can I ask a question on the
Of course.
child welfare? Why can't we split this out between the actual counties and teams as opposed to the service region?
We did that because too many of the teams had no data, but I can get you the county information or the specific team information. Yep. When we look at case types in justice, in the entry into juvenile justice system, I just want to point out here that oftentimes when juveniles get into trouble, they've done more than one thing at one time, right? More than one thing is on that petition. Justice only provides me with the most serious offense. Okay, so if you look at that data and you think, gosh, we have more status offenses than this that come into our courts, you're probably right. But if the youth committed a status offense and a misdemeanor, it will only show up as a misdemeanor for us for our analysis purposes. So it's the most serious charge that you're seeing on there. I'm going to skip ahead to our last section, just briefly here. When we look at our YRTC commitments, that excludes any commitment from a tribal court. Okay, so those are not in our data. They're not attached to a county, therefore they're not attached to a team. And then for our probation data, which is our last data point, this is probation specific to a court perspective. So what that means is that at a disposition, a juvenile was told they needed to attend probation, right, and connect with a probation officer. Now, from probation's perspective, they might actually start working with the youth prior to disposition. And so for their perspective, that youth is already on probation or working with probation. They're getting probation services. But from our perspective, from a court perspective, they're not, right? And so if you compare this to maybe other probation numbers you've seen, ours are probably a little bit lower for that reason, okay? All right, our last section, and I would save this one for last because it's our newest section, and so we noticed some more quirks with this particular section. We use that same method I told you about with the 3A analysis where we backed up our petition file date to draw our cases, so that's very similar. As far as missing data is more likely with this particular section than it is with the 3A section, and that's because we're just really starting to monitor this and pay attention to it. We started identifying many of the juvenile justice critical codes, those things we want to make sure clerks are entering and we're following up on. That only began as of January 1st, 2015. So we expect to see more missing data in this section, and the CIP team will work with the justice team and try and improve those numbers as we go along. I also want to point out that the cases that we analyze do not include any case that was filed as a supplemental petition. We don't get that data, right? So if a case is filed as a supplemental petition, we don't have case progression data for it. And then lastly, one of the things we realized as we were going through this data is that we are unsure of the role that diversion is playing in our case progression. While ideally a youth would be given diversion prior to having a petition filed, and that's how we kind of hope it operates, I think many of you in here know that that's not always the case, right? That we might have a petition file and then the youth enters diversion, which is great, still an opportunity for diversion. The problem is, from my perspective of data analysis, it looks like we're not hitting our hearings on time, right? And it's because we don't have a way yet to really monitor when youth are entering into diversion. And so that's something that Linda and I have discussed and that we're also working on. But we just want you to keep that in mind when you're looking at the juvenile justice case progression, is that that point of entry of a youth into diversion may affect whether or not they're hitting their hearings in a specified time, okay? So at this point, what I will do, oops, I went too far, is leave this sort of summary of bullet points that I've talked about. And while you're working with your teams, I'll be available to walk around. So I held your lunch. Now you get to interrupt me frequently while I try to eat mine. And I'll come around and answer any questions that you may have, look up things that you may have questions about, and we can go ahead and start that.